talking about sort of a little snapshot of our community and the demographics of it. I looked at both Whitewater, the 53190 zip code, and the university campus and the percentages. Now, do you remember? You don't have to be exact. Do you remember what percent of around what percent of unreached there were, unchurched there were in the 53190 zip code?
95.
It's about 97%. Or 95%, again, depending on if we, unchurched, we talk about unchurched versus, someone might be sitting in a pew but never hearing the gospel, and do we count those or not? But we don't have to argue over numbers at that point, right? There's a lot of need. And then on campus, do you remember what those numbers were? Looking just at the campus ministries versus the student population.
97.
It was like 97% unreached. And so even since then, Luke and I talked on Friday, those campus ministries I mentioned, like I told you, I gave them, their best case scenarios or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, I go through that list. Yeah, they closed down last semester. They're not meeting anymore. Don't know anything about them. They have 2 students. So even that number I gave you, my optimistic number of 97% is actually probably higher than that. That's kind of discouraging. Why am I bringing this up here? I want to give you, there's a picture, a perspective of the world around us. And when I say the world around us, I don't mean those guys out there. I don't mean them, although in some ways maybe I do. But the world around us influences us as well. It affects the way we think about things and view things, even within the church. And so if you think about our world as a postmodern world, you've heard that term, maybe you've read about it and thought about it, but in a postmodern world, the really concept is that no one really knows the answers to life. No one can put the world together in a way that makes sense, and so therefore we can all just sort of define our own truth. There is no sense of the purpose of man or how the unfolding of history. There is no making sense of it. In the West, we get to the place where, and when I say the Western world, is so the Western hemisphere sort of, where science has sort of taken over or disproved religion is sort of the thinking. And so the scientific world is what we turn to for answers, but they're not real answers. They're just data points. And so what we do is we create our own world the best we can. And so our belief system might be in our political system. I mean, we just went through a pretty difficult electoral season, and you see what happens when people put their belief and their hope in a political system. It's not the best place to do it. Our belief, our hope might be in a philosophical school. If we only think a certain way or think a right way, that's where we'll have hope from, and it doesn't quite work. But those things don't do it. So maybe we do believe in a religion, but it's sort of the sense of, this idea of, and I just tell you, the 97% of the people out there, and some of us in here, but this sense of like, yeah, I believe in God. There's this concept of God. I believe God exists. I even believe God loves me because I've heard it so many. God loves you. Jesus loves me. I learned that when I was a kid. But what does that really mean? If God loves me, but my world's a mess and it doesn't make any sense. So how can that be? And so it's kind of just taken away of all of its power, the power of the gospel, the power that we just celebrated in communion, recognizing what Jesus Christ has done. It's all gone. It's just this generic concept. And so what we're trying to do here is break down and understand the point of history, the point of God's story in what is sometimes called a meta-narrative, just an overarching concept, and understand that it's real. And that will help us, even as Christians, then to understand the context of history from God's eyes. It'll help us understand our purpose as individuals, our culture, our governmental systems, through the eyes of what God is doing throughout history. And that we really have to get to that point to understand it. So this week, we're going to go over sort of the history from, I would say, from a biblical perspective. And we're going to go through, you ready for this? We're going to go through the entire Old Testament today. You ready? It's going to be awesome. And then the next few weeks, we'll kind of look at little parts of it and chunks of it. But the thing is, we have to understand sort of that overarching of how it all works, so we know how it all fits together and where it comes. And I just love, I think it's what we've been doing at Bible Quest. We start at the beginning and we're building onto it and going to it. So those of you that come to Kids Club, Bible Quest, you're actually ahead of everyone else. So congratulations. You guys are the scholars in the room. And but what we see, though, is that these scriptures are really important. All the Old Testament, it's long, it's some of it is hard to read, some of it might even argue is boring, but they all point to Jesus. And we can't just come up, and especially in our world today, in our culture, 97% unchurched, and I'm not talking about the unreached nations on the other side of the world, I'm talking about our neighbors. If you talk about Jesus, it's completely out of context. They don't understand who Jesus was, or just that maybe he was a great teacher, or he's this guy hanging on the cross up there. This is the concept, and we have to understand where he comes from. And that is what we see in the Old Testament. And not only that, we see it as Jesus talked about himself, we see it as his followers, the apostles, talked about the Old Testament and the way that they used it. So we are going to go to Luke 24, and I read just a little bit about that in preparing us for communion, but we're going to look at some of these verses. And if you remember, again, this is the road to Emmaus, where it's literally the exact day Jesus just rose from the dead. Sunday morning, he's out of the grave. These disciples they leave Jerusalem, they're walking back, maybe to home. We know one of their names is Cleopas, we don't know the other one names, and they're walking along, and they are trying to figure out what's going on, because they've heard these rumors, and they're not sure if it's true, and they don't know what to make of it, and they just don't really know what's going on. So here it is, Jesus just shows up, like, hey, can I walk with you for a while? Sure, come along, let's, bide the time. He just shows up with them, and he's talking to them. So let's pick up that story then. Luke 24, at verse 13, it says, "Behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things which had taken place." All these things. This was, Jesus' ministry, everyone thinking he's a Messiah, seeing all these miraculous healings, hearing his teaching, seeing him get turned over to Pilate, hearing the mobs cry out to crucify him, seeing him die, seeing him get buried in the ground, and hearing rumors that he had raised from the dead. Or at least the tomb was empty. And this is all the things they were talking about. Trust me, we're 2,000 years later, we're still talking about these things. But this was very fresh for these guys, and they were very confused. So they're talking about these things. Verse 14. Verse 15, while they were discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. So now the conversation continues to unfold. It's clear that they weren't grasping the significance of what had happened. And Jesus gets to a point, and he responded with this explanation of what his death and resurrection was really all about. So if you just go down then to verse 25, Jesus said to them, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" And then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in the Scriptures. I don't know about you, but for me, every time I read that, I say, man, I wish I was in that conversation. I wish I could have listened into that. I wish I had known what Jesus said about Moses and all the prophets and how he explained himself in the Scriptures. I wish I could have been there. Well, if you keep going down, now they actually, the part I read to you, they're dining, they don't know the guy, but they're like, why don't you stay with us? It's evening, stay a while. They stay, they eat a meal together. He breaks the bread, their eyes are open, and then Jesus vanishes. And I think he's got a little bit of sense of humor there. And they're like, oh my gosh, we've got to tell everybody, like, we heard these rumors, and it's really true. He really did rise from the dead. And so they go we were surmising on Wednesday, either running or going back, but we think they were in a hurry to get back. Let's just say that. And they ran back, and they went and they knocked on the door to the 11 and the others, and they said, listen, Jesus just appeared to us. Can you believe it? So they're there and talking about it. And let's pick up the story then in verse 44. And so Jesus shows up now with this group, the group of the 11 and the others, and he said to them, Jesus said to them, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. And then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. Isn't that amazing? Can you just imagine what it would be like to be there? To have the Scriptures opened up to us in the mind's eyes from the words of Jesus. And in Luke's gospel, he doesn't tell us what it is, which is really maddening. Come on, Luke, you're the most thorough gospel writer of us all. You should tell us what he did, but he didn't. And so how do we know? Do we just guess? Do we surmise? And that's kind of been my thought the whole time until I did some study this week, and it was pointed out to me as I'm going through. I should mention this. A lot of this coming through the Antioch School, which is where I'm very slowly, painfully, laboriously getting my master's degree. Don't ask me how long I've been working on it. I won't tell you. But I was reading some things from that. So see, I am working on it, so you know. And they mentioned how in the book of Acts, and we're not going to look at these passages, but I encourage you to study them, that in the book of Acts we see, first of all, Peter had like 5 different sermons. And in Peter, what did he do? All of his sermons, he started with Moses and the prophets, and he opened the Scriptures. And then we see Stephen, right before he's martyred and he's stoned, they let him speak in Acts chapter 7. And we see that Stephen, in his speech to them, in his sermon, he starts with Moses and the prophets, and he works his way through Old Testament history. For 53 verses he does that. And then we see Paul in Acts 13 in his Jewish synagogue in Pisidian Antioch. For 26 verses, he gives a full explanation of the storyline from Moses and the prophets and the writings. And so I had never made that connection. How do we know what Jesus did? How do we ever know what Jesus did? Because his disciples did what he did. And his disciples taught how they were taught. Jesus opened their mind to understand the Scriptures through the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. And when they gave their sermons, especially to the Jewish people, that's how they did it. So we are going to do that this morning. I'm not going to say Jesus probably did it a little longer than I did. I don't know what his timeline was. I don't know if they had to go to lunch or stopped or whatever. But we're going to do this, and we're going to go through the Old Testament. Now, so that's all I'm going to say about that, because that's all I'm going to say. So it's a walk through the Old Testament, through the storyline and from God's perspective. So first, this is just a backdrop. Genesis 1 through 11. Now we could spend 11 weeks on Genesis 1 through 11 or 11 years, but we're going to spend less than 11 minutes on it, but more than 11 seconds. So, because we're really going to start in Genesis 12, that's with Abraham, but we have to understand here that the backdrop of the story starts in Genesis 1 through 11. Many of you might be familiar with this, but I don't want to assume. And let me just tell you, I encourage you, if you can, I'm going to have sort of like bullet point notes up here. Just grab the bullet points, and there's going to be some review times in between. And see, my challenge to you is take these bullet points and then retell it. Retell it when you're sitting at the family table tonight. Or retell it to a friend when you go see them, because that's when it's going to solidify. And we need to know this well, so that when we start to dive into these very specific sections, we know, okay, what's happening here? Why is, what's the timeline? What's going on here? And whatnot. Okay, so Genesis 1 and 2, creation. God created in the beginning. God created everything. Things were wonderful. That lasted for 2 chapters. Genesis 3, we mess it up. The fall. Adam, Eve make a bad decision. They disobey God. They get sent out. We are now separated from God. We got a problem. That's an important point, because the rest of the Bible is working on fixing that problem. Genesis 4, just to emphasize that point, Cain kills Abel. First murder, first brothers. Anyone who's got a brother probably understands. I didn't have a brother. I had a very loving, dear sister, so I never wanted to kill her, but she wanted to kill me sometimes. Evil continues to develop. Genesis 6 through 8. That's the flood account. The world is so evil that God says, I just got to destroy the whole thing. Now, I tell you, there are many times I think our world's pretty bad, but God hasn't destroyed it yet. The second time, like He will when Jesus comes back. So I think, man, it had to be really, really wicked in Noah's time. And that happens, 6 or 8. Then they're told to populate the world. Now chapters 5 and 10 in the middle there are really genealogies that really are just tying Adam all the way to Abraham. It's just some genealogy gaps. And then we have chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, really where people saying, hey, we want to try and get to God on our own power. We can do it ourselves. And if we work together, we can do it. That was not God's plan or intention. He said, nope, they're going to scatter them. All these different languages happen. And that gets us to chapter 12. So here's the 4 kind of segments we're going to look at. Abraham to Joseph, Joseph to Moses, Moses to Joshua, and Joshua to the exile, which is the whole rest of the Old Testament. So there you go. Here it is, Abraham to Joseph. So, just like Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, that's where he started. We're going to start with Abraham and his family. Abraham was chosen by God to be the father of many nations. He was born in Ur of the Chaldeans. So that's where our journey starts. Now, in the nursery this morning, I had all the kids. We geographically walked from corner to corner of the whole room so we could know where we were. I won't have you do that now, I should have a map, but I don't have that either, so deal with it. God tells him to leave Ur, go to the place he'd show him. So Abraham leaves Ur with his family, his wife Sarah, his father Terah, his nephew Lot. So those are the 4 main characters we begin. We've got Abraham, Sarah, his wife, Terah is his father, and Lot, his nephew. 4 key people. They leave, they travel up the Euphrates River, because that's the trade route. They're following the trade route. They come to the town of Haran. They live there for 23 years. They get very rich. Terah dies in Haran. That's Abraham's father. Then Abraham, Sarah, and Lot go southwest to the land of Canaan, and they settle there. There, God promises Abraham 3 things. He promises them land. That's Israel today. He promises them descendants. He said a great nation will come from his line. And he promises them blessing. He says, through you, Abraham, God says, God will bless all the nations through the line of Abraham. So now Abraham has 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob has 12 sons. The second to the youngest is Joseph. Okay, so tell me, where does our story start? What city? You could just shout it out. Yeah, and those of you on Zoom, even though you're muted, trust me, shout it out. It'll be helpful. Don't unmute yourself, though, but just shout it out. No one will think you're weird except for the other people in the room. Okay, who are the 4 main characters?
Abraham, Sarah, Terah, and Lot.
Good. And then God told them to go, what river do they go up? Euphrates. Why do they go up the Euphrates?
Trade route.
It's a trade route. What town do they come to? Who dies there?
Terah.
And then what land do they go into? Okay, what 3 things did God promise Abraham? Good. 2 sons of Abraham. 2 sons of Isaac. How many sons did Jacob have?
12.
What was his second youngest? Joseph. Okay, look it. We're 4th of the way done already. Isn't that amazing? Now that's all, that's all in Genesis. Okay, actually not even this part of Genesis. Now we're in the second part. Joseph to Moses. Okay. Now the story focuses in on Joseph. After all that, and trust me, that was a speed run. Through Joseph, we see that God will begin to fulfill his promise to Abraham and his descendants to make them a great nation. And this comes about in an unusual way in the life of Joseph. He was willing to follow God's unfolding plan. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, just like Joseph is my favorite son. But Joseph was the second youngest for Jacob. Jacob gave his son a coat of many colors. I gave my son clothes. I don't know. Joseph's older brothers all hated him. Joseph's sisters, no, I'm not going to. And so he is sold into slavery into the country of Egypt. in the house of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials who's the captain of the guard. There, Joseph rises to become manager over Potiphar's house. So he's down in the depths. He rises up. He's still a slave, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him and then lies about him, and Joseph winds up in prison. But then Joseph rises to the top in prison, where he's put in charge of all the prisoners, and he eventually interprets Pharaoh's dream of a coming famine, and he's put in charge of Pharaoh's house. He's literally becomes the second in command of Pharaoh. When I hear this, I think, you can't keep a good man down. He gets put down, he just keeps rising to the top, just floating to the top. But now, there's a famine in the land of Canaan also. So here's Joseph down in Egypt. Here's all the Israelites, they weren't called that yet, but in Canaan. And through a number of circumstances, Joseph brings his family down to Egypt, sparing them of the famine. There they grow in numbers. Jacob blesses his sons and dies. And the key to Joseph's success is summed up in some of his closing words to his brothers. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. So glad that Joseph had that perspective. So through Joseph, God preserves Abraham's lineage and grows Israel into a great nation. Most people think 2.5 million people is what they think. So after Joseph dies, a new Pharaoh takes over who does not know Joseph. He's afraid of the large number of Israelites, and he puts them into slavery. And so we call this the 400-year Egyptian captivity. So, Joseph is favored by his father, hated by his brothers. What country is he sold into? Egypt. He's in the house of Potiphar. He eventually becomes what? The highest. Yes, over all of Egypt. Because of the famine, Joseph brings his family down where? To Egypt. Israel grows into what? A great nation. About how many people? 2.5 million. After Joseph dies, new Pharaoh takes over, and we call that period the
400-year.
Yes, the 400-year Egyptian captivity. Look at this. We're halfway done. You thought we'd be here all morning. Here we are. Now we're going from Moses to Joshua. This I couldn't fit on one screen, so we have to... Okay, so at the end of the 400 years, the people cry out to God for a deliverer, and God raises up a mighty deliverer named Moses. He tells Pharaoh, God said, let my people go. That's what he said, yeah. And Pharaoh doesn't listen. So God sends plagues. They worship frogs. So God sends them lots of frogs. They worship the river. So God turns the river into blood. All the plagues are related to their gods. You can do a deep study into that. It's really cool. God brings about the plagues for 3 reasons. First, to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Second, to convince Israel that they should follow Moses. Because if you read that story, they're not super convinced that he's the right guy. And third, to put down the Egyptian gods. God wants to make sure everyone knows that he is the one true God, not all the other gods. That's still true today, by the way. So Moses leads the nation of Israel out of Egypt. And then after parting the Red Sea, Moses leads them south to Mount Sinai, where God gives them the law. And at Mount Sinai, it's when Israel formally becomes a nation. They make this covenant with God. God gives them the law. This essentially becomes their constitution. And the law has 3 divisions. Civil law, ceremonial law, and moral law. By the way, when we're interpreting the Old Testament, it's very important. If you're reading those Old Testament laws, it's very important for us to determine which of those are civil, ceremonial, and moral, because it makes a difference on how we apply them to our lives today. Those moral laws are called the 10 Commandments, which are actually the first principles of the whole law. Now, a number of years ago, I was challenged at a training to memorize the 10 Commandments. They say, this I don't hear it as much anymore, but there was a time we were fighting. 10 Commandments were getting removed from the townhouse squares and from the courthouses, and people were fighting and protesting, saying, we need the 10 Commandments there. We need to have them there. It's part of our history and heritage. And I was challenged at that moment. He said, okay, we're making all those fights. How many of you have memorized the 10 Commandments? All right, 2.5. Okay, so yes, we want to acknowledge that that's a part of our history and who we are as a people in the United States. But man, if we really think it's important, let's take the time to memorize it, right? So let me just give you a little chance to memorize the 10 Commandments. There's only 10 of them, the 10 Commandments. Okay, so those are really the first principles of the whole law. Altogether, there are 613 laws. I would not encourage you to memorize all of them, but if you want to, sure, go for it. God forms the entire law into a covenant with Israel. If they obey, they will be blessed. If they disobey, they will be cursed. And in a way, this really forms the rest of the history of Israel until the coming of Christ. You can see all of Israel's history. When they obeyed, it went well with them. When they disobeyed, it did not go well with them. So Moses leads them just south of the promised land to a town called Kadesh Barnea. They send 12 spies into the land to see if they can conquer it. When the spies come back, 10 say, don't do it. They say no because they're afraid, but 2 say, let's go. Those 2 are Joshua and Caleb. As a result, they decide not to enter the land. God sentences them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until everyone over 19 years old dies. Okay, raise your hand if you're under 19 in this room. Okay, you're the only ones left. It's all up to you. And everyone that is except Joshua and Caleb. So there can be 2 people get to be faithful. You guys, we'll decide who that is. 2 of us over 19. Okay, then Moses leads them up to the plains of Moab to enter the land a second time. Here he preaches, sometimes it's considered 5 big sermons. In essence, he gives them the law a second time. Like, hey, let me just reinforce this in your mind. And before they go into the land, God promises again that they will be blessed, or if they obey, they'll be blessed. If they disobey, they'll be cursed. Okay, there's the other part you're supposed to see. And lastly, then Moses dies, and the new leader is raised up, Joshua. All right, so here we are. Review. God raised up the deliverer. Who was it?
Moses.
All right, Pharaoh wouldn't let the Israelites go, so God brought about the plague for 3 reasons. What's the first one? Convince Pharaoh. Second? Convince Israel. The third one? Put down the Egyptians. Good. Moses leads them across what sea?
Red Sea.
Takes them to where? Gives them what?
The law.
What are the 3 divisions?
Civil, ceremonial, moral.
Okay. The first principles of the law are called 10 Commandments. How many laws are there altogether?
613.
How many know them all? You know, one of them is do not lie.
That's right.
God makes a covenant with them. Obey and be
Blessed.
disobey and be.
Cursed.
They say the law. They say they will obey. They say. And so Moses leads them across the wilderness to the town of Kadesh Barnea. And they send spies in the land. How many?
12.
How many say no?
10.
How many say go?
2.
What are their names? Good. So, who do they listen to?
The 10.
The 10. So what happens?
You have to wander.
They wander in the wilderness. For how long?
40 years.
Until when?
He died.
Well, who? Yeah, you remember that for some reason because you're under 19. That's right. Yeah, and except for who? Joshua and Caleb, right. So then Moses leads them where? You need a cheat sheet? Wait a minute. Leads them to where? The plains of Moab. Yes, and he gives them the law a second time. And then we have a new leader, the general. His name is? Joshua. Look at this. 1 section left. Now, if you notice, we've made it through the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are called usually the books of Moses. Yeah, you remember we were doing that Bible trivia. It was like Second Moses. That's what it was talking about. So here we are, the last Joshua to the exile, the rest of the Old Testament. Here it is. Joshua leads them across the river at flood stage, the Jordan River. Right away, right square in the way, in the middle of Canaan, is Jericho. In essence, it's the capital of Canaan. It has 2 walls around it. The inner wall is so big you can drive chariots on it, which makes me want to do that. And God gives them a strategy, which Joshua obeys. They're told to march around the walls each day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, blow your horns, and the walls will fall down. We reenacted that this morning, too. That was fun. So archaeologists have actually uncovered these very walls, and they found one falling out and one falling in. Isn't that cool? And so we say they had a smashing success. So now they go 14 miles northwest to a little tiny city called Ai, and they're defeated. Why are they defeated? Because this guy, Achan, stole some treasure that was supposed to be God's. and he hid it in his tent. It was against what God commanded. And so we say they suffer an Achan defeat. And so, I know you like it. Once Achan is taken care of, by getting swallowed up in the ground, we reenacted that too. That was fun. They won victories in the region of Gibeon, and then they separated by separating to the north and the south. So they surrounded them basically. It was a good strategy. Then Joshua takes his soldiers on a southern campaign. They go to the south, and there they take the south totally as God commanded. They wiped out all the people like God told them to do. Then they go to the north, and they take the north partially, not fully obeying God. This is a point that I'd never really thought about before when I read this. That in the South throughout history, as we'll see, was more faithful, and because they more completely followed God's command. And in the North, they only partially followed it, and they had troubles almost from day one. Not a coincidence. So really, it's time to take care of things. So it's time to take care of them. Okay, now the land is divided into 12 parts because there are 12 tribes of Joshua. Oh, we're still there. Good. Okay. Now, following the division of the land, God raises up judges to rule the land. Some are good, some are bad. Sometimes the people obey, but mostly they disobey. Anybody name some judges that you know? Deborah. Gideon.
Ehud.
Oh, yeah, Ehud, or Ehud is how you call him. That's right. Yeah, he's left-handed, so on. Samson. Yeah, you got, there was a bunch of them, but Ehud you got. Samuel, Samuel was the last judge, sort of. Deborah is the only female judge. Samson's a real strong guy. You know about them. Gideon, someone mentioned Gideon, right? I just didn't repeat it, yeah. Gideon, the mighty warrior who was hiding in the air, I love it. Anyway, lots of ups and downs in the period of Judges, but overall, it was characterized by anarchy. If you have to say anything about Judges, everyone did as they saw fit. Now, the people look around, they see other nations, and they see that they have kings. So they say, hey, we want a king. And Samuel said, no, you don't want a king. They're going to tax you, they're going to make you serve him, and God doesn't want you to have a king. So don't have a king. But they said, no, we want a king. So God said, all right, I'll give you a king. So God told Samuel, who is the last judge, sort of, and the first prophet, to anoint the first king, Saul. And you can read about Saul in 1 Samuel, the book of the Bible, 1 Samuel. Then Saul has some problems. God removes him. God has Samuel anoint his second king, David, who is described as a man after God's own heart. And you can read about David in 2 Samuel. Now, God further clarifies the promise he made with Abraham by promising David in a covenant that the coming king who will bring in the kingdom will come from his line, establishing David's throne forever. This is a key point that we will come back to. So the third king is David's son, Solomon. And that's described in 1 Kings. So if you're going through the Bible, then you got 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings. We're walking through the kings. And Solomon is the one who then will build the temple for God. And David and Solomon also wrote most of the writings, which is the third section of the Jewish scriptures. We read about that in Luke 24. And those writings will include like the Psalms. David wrote a lot of Psalms, not all of them. Solomon wrote wisdom literature like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. So some key guys. Then we get to the fourth king, which is Rehoboam. That's Solomon's son. So we're still passing down the line. He wants to become richer than his father, so he taxes the people to death. And there is a revolt. Does that sound familiar? As a result, the kingdom splits. Jeroboam, a general, goes to the north, and Rehoboam goes to the south. 10 tribes go to the north, 2 tribes go to the south. The 10 in the north are called Israel, and the 2 in the south are called Judah. This is important. If you read a lot of the Old Testament, it can get really confusing if you don't make the distinction between Israel and Judah. Okay? So, God raises up prophets. And he's going to try and shape up Israel and Judah, but no one listens. So the writings of these prophets are a section of the prophets of Jewish scripture called the latter prophets. So that would be like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the book of the 12 minor prophets. Those are the 12 little books at the end of the Old Testament, the 12 minor prophets. They're not minor because they're insignificant, but because they're smaller. I don't know their stature, but the books are smaller. The former prophets give the history of the kings. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the former prophets, you'll see they kind of interact with those type of people. Okay? Now, because they don't listen, what does God do? Just as he promised in his covenant on Mount Sinai, and in the second giving of the law on the plains of Moab, he's told them twice, he brings in the Assyrians from the north to take the northern tribes captive. And the Assyrians are cruel and feared. They're known for ripping apart their prisoners while still alive. These are not the people I would want to capture me. Okay? And they display piles of human skulls. I think you need to know that part. This is 200 years after the split of the kingdom. So the kingdom split, they live as divided kingdoms for 200 years until this date, 722 BC. I was a biblical studies major in college, and that was one date I had to memorize, 722 BC. So you should have to memorize it too, just because. The prophets in the south then, that's Judah, right, start prophesying to Judah, but they don't listen either. So then God brings in the Babylonians to take them captive for 70 years. The Babylonians are different than the Assyrians. The Babylonians are educators. So they take young men like Daniel and his companions and educate them to serve the king by ruling over their own people. If I got to choose who took me over, I would choose the Babylonians. But the captivity lasts for 150 years after the Assyrian captivity. So why were they captive for 7 years? God says in his word, because they didn't let the land lay rest every seventh year as commanded in the law. That was a plan to deal with the poor and to let them start over. And so God will bring about his commands one way or another, whether we follow them or whether he has someone else work through them to follow them. So after the Babylonians, we have a new empire, the Medes and the Persians. You can read about that in the book of Daniel. And then under the Medes and the Persians, God starts to allow Judah to come back into the land in 3 expeditions. You probably wanted to be seeing all that all the time. Okay, the first expedition was led by Zerubbabel, and he rebuilds the temple. The second expedition is led by Ezra. He rebuilds the hearts of the people. They repent and come back to the Lord. The third is led back by Nehemiah, and he rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. Then after that, there's a great period of silence for 400 years between the Jewish scriptures and the coming of Jesus the Messiah. The prominent world ruler during this time is Alexander the Great. And because he's Greek, when we get to the New Testament will be written in Greek. All right, so let's see how we can do. Here's our final review. We don't have a final review. Okay, so Joshua, all the way back to Joshua. He takes them across what river?
Jordan.
To which city? And they have a what? Smashing success. And then they go to what little town? Ai, and they suffer what? An Achan defeat. And then they go down to the south, and how do they take that? Totally. Yep, completely. And when they go to the north, how do they take that? Partially. And then they divide the land into how many parts? Okay, then there start to be rulers. What are they called? Well, you already named some of them for me. Okay, this period is characterized by what? Anarchy. Okay, anarchy. Then they look around. They see all the other nations have what? So they want one. So the last judge and the first prophet is also the king anointer. His name is? The first king is?
Saul.
You read about him in what book? And the second king is?
David.
What book do you read about him? And then God told David that his throne would last how long? Forever. That's a key point. The third king is? Whose son is he? What book do we read about? First Kings. And the fourth king? Rehoboam. Whose son is he? Solomon's. Are you? Oh no, we're almost there. Okay. He wanted to be greater than his father, so he taxed the people to death. And the result, the kingdom splits. Who goes to the north? Who goes to the south? How many tribes go north? How many tribes go south? What's the north called? What's the south called?
Judah.
Awesome. Now, who does God raise up to try and shape up Israel and Judah? The prophets. Nobody listens. So, who does God bring in from the north to take Israel captive? What type of people are they?
Nasty.
Yes. How many years after the split kingdom? 200. The prophets start going to the south, but nobody listens. So, who does God bring in? What kind of people are they? Educators. How long are they in captivity? 70 years. Why? They didn't let the land rest. How many years is this captivity after the Assyrian captivity? 150 years. Now a new empire takes over. Who are they? The Medes and the Persians. They allow the Jews to come back in 3 expeditions. The first is led by? Yeah, you said it like I did. And he rebuilds what? The second is led by? He rebuilds what? Third is led by? He rebuilds what? Good. How long is the silent period between the Jewish scriptures and the coming of Christ? 400 years. Who was a prominent world ruler during this time? He's Greek, and so the New Testament is written in? Greek. Now, the one lesson, no, there's a bunch of lessons in there, but if you want your language to be used to write books, then you need to take over the world. That's one lesson for you. Okay. Now, throughout this whole history, and you did a great job, by the way. How are we doing? We make it? Whew, there's the Old Testament. What do you think? Here's the point. Israel, all along this history, Israel missed the very purpose and plan God had for them. Remember, God said, through Abraham, I want to bless all the nations. You just obey me. And instead, they twisted the storyline. And they misinterpreted the narrative of the Jewish scriptures. And so that's why, taking it all the way back to Luke 24, when Jesus came and when Jesus taught, he actually, you know why the Pharisees didn't like him? The Pharisees taught the law. The Pharisees taught Moses and the prophets and the writings. And Jesus said, you're not teaching it right. You've twisted it. And he untwisted it. But they didn't like that. They said, no, you're twisting it. And they said, no, you are. No, you're not. And that's what happened. And so we have to make sure that we're understanding the scriptures according to God's plan, which I think I would trust Jesus over the Pharisees if I have to pick one of those. And so I know this is a lot today, and it's kind of it's like overview, but as we start to, in the next following weeks, to kind of dive into little sections of these, as we look at the great storyline, if we don't do this first, it's going to be like, oh, now you're picking a random thing, now you're picking a random thing. So I hope you see the value of it. But also this, whether we believe in Jesus or not, or even if we're a Christian or not, we need to understand this story. It's actually the storyline not only for Christianity, but also for Judaism and for Islam. These are the 3 major world religions that actually look at history and combine it with a transcendent. And what I mean by that is that they're looking at physical, real history and how a spiritual intersects into that and intervenes in that. The Eastern religions certainly have a history, but they're more focused on the transcendent, this only spiritual. So they're not as concerned about actual physical history and timelines and real historical characters. This is why it's significant. The studying of history actually is a studying of looking for God's hand throughout. And so now we have this outline that we can come back to. And like I said, if you can rehearse that with your family or other places throughout the week, share it with other people, use the bullet points. Even if you want, I can send you this PowerPoint. You can have those bullet points so that as we're reading the Old Testament, as we start to dive into it and study it, we can reference these and keep the whole picture in mind, even as we look into smaller pieces. So, this morning, I know is way more academic than, for example, the last 2 months when we've been looking at the one another passages and how we apply that in our lives. But I do believe that the work that we've done this morning is a good groundwork for the rest of the series and hopefully for the rest of our lives. So I encourage you, again, share it with people, cement it into your hearts. And let me just pray for us that we would not be like the Israelites, that we would respond to God as He calls us.